tonight's meeting of the Urban Planning Delegated Committee. Before we commence the meeting, I request that all mobile telephones be turned off or switched to silent. Thank you. This meeting is being live streamed on the Council website, so you will be able to view the proceedings of the meeting, councillor deliberations and voting. The meeting is also being recorded and will be made available on the Council website as soon as practicable after the meeting. Should technical problems be encountered during the meeting will be adjourned until the problem is rectified, or if needed, the meeting will be postponed. My name is Councillor Jim Park and I chair this committee. I'll start by introducing my fellow councillors and officers. Seated at the horseshoe table, to my left, the Mayor, Councillor Gary Thompson, Councillor Susan Bigger, Councillor Cynthia Watson, Councillor Nick Stavrou, and across on the other side, Councillor Lisa Hollingsworth, Councillor Wes Galt, Councillor Di Gillies, Councillor Jane Addis, and Councillor Victor Franco. Officers in attendance tonight, the Chief Executive Officer, Philip Storer, is seated behind Councillor Watson. Seated immediately to my right is Sharan Wickramasinghe, the Director of Urban Living. To his right, Simon Mitchell, the Manager of Strategic and Statutory Planning. Seated to my immediate left, Kirsten Ritchie, the Coordinator of Governance. And to her left, Helen Pavlidis, the Senior Governance Officer. There are a number of other officers in attendance this evening, and they'll be introduced as they present their reports. Essentially, the purpose of the Urban Planning Delegated Committee is to deal with issues under the Planning and Environment Act and the Building Act. This committee has delegated authority to make decisions on behalf of Council. Councillors are familiar with the reports, which include a summary of the objections received. For those in the gallery presenting this evening, when we come to the agenda item, it will be introduced by an officer. I will then call you one by one to come forward and address the committee. If you're making a submission, please present your viewpoints clearly and concisely on why you support or oppose the planning application. Please don't repeat what earlier speakers have said and keep your submission focused on relevant issues and points not previously raised. If you are opposed to the planning application, please inform the committee why you are opposed and suggest an alternative approach which would satisfy your concerns. Please focus on your concerns rather than matters of history or detail in the officer's report. Note that there is a strict time limit of 3 minutes for each speaker, including councillors, and whilst as chairperson I reserve the right to vary that time, I seldom do. I will ask speakers to stand at the lectern, and those speaking against will be invited to speak first, followed by those in favour. At the 2.5 minute mark, you'll hear a bell, and that will indicate that you have 30 seconds remaining to conclude your presentation. Turning now to the agenda, apologies. Ms Ritchie, we have received an apology from Councillor Sinfield. Are there any others?
Through you, Mr Chair, there are no further apologies.
Thank you. Item 1, adoption and confirmation of the minutes of the meeting held on 12 April 2021. Councillor Thompson.
Happy to move the minutes.
Thank you. And the seconder, that's seconded by Councillor Bigger. Is there any discussion on that item? Then I put that motion. Those in favour? That's carried unanimously. Item 2, declaration of conflict of interest of any councillor or council officer. Are there any declarations? No? Item 3, presentation of officer reports. Item 3.1, amendment Hawthorn East Heritage Gap Study, consideration of the panel report. That will be introduced by Robert Costello, Senior Project Planner. Thank you.
Okay. Amendment C308 to the Burundale Planning Scheme seeks to apply the heritage overlay to 18 individual heritage places, 8 heritage precincts and 1 extension to an existing heritage precinct. The purpose of this report is to inform the Urban Planning Delegated Committee of the panel's recommendations for the amendment and provide the officer's response to the panel's recommendations. A panel hearing for Amendment C308 was held on the 28th of September to the 1st of October in 2020. 10 submitters presented at the panel hearing. The panel was supportive of Council's position at the hearing, except for regrade the property at 21 Aberdeen Street, Hawthorn East from contributory to non-contributory in the Brickfields Environs Precinct, carry out further research to assess submissions made in support of upgrading the status of Currajong, 337 Auburn Road, Hawthorn East from contributory to individually significant, remove 356 and 358 Auburn Road, Hawthorn East from the Longford Estate and Environs Precinct, and remove the property at 22 Cambridge Street, Hawthorn East. Officers commissioned Silverberg Consulting to review the heritage recommendations relating to 337 Auburn Road, Hawthorn, following the My microphone turned off, apologies. I've lost my place. The consultant has recommended the property be regraded from contributory to the Longford Estate and Environs Precinct to individually significant. Officers are recommending this be undertaken through a separate planning scheme amendment based on advice from the Department of Environment, Land, Water and Planning. Officers note reference on page 11 of the UPDC report to 46 Campbell Street, Hawthorn East. This is also mentioned by the panel in their panel report. The correct address is 64 Campbell Road, Hawthorn East. This correction is for the UPDC's noting only, and no other documents circulated as part of tonight's agenda need to be amended. The explanation of the officer's response to the recommendations is detailed in the report and attachment 2. Given the changes made to the amendment following public exhibition and endorsed by the UPSC on 3rd of February 2020 and subsequent changes recommended by the panel, officers recommend that the committee refer Amendment C308 to an ordinary meeting of Council for adoption with the changes recommended by officers. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you. So we have 6 speakers wishing to address the committee. So I'll start with Ms. Helen Slee. If you could just come up to the lectern, and I'd ask that you commence your presentation with your name and address. Thank you. Just a minute, we'll just turn your mic. There we go.
That helps. My name is Helen Slee and my address is 17 Derby Street, Camberwell. I'm at this meeting tonight as a resident who's not an owner of any of these properties under consideration, but I want to speak about how the page 6 engage with owners and developers to achieve a balance between development and protection of neighbourhood character, heritage and amenity. The reality is that many, many owners just look at the cost and the price they'll get when they sell the house if it can be demolished, no matter how much of a heritage property it is. I have a heritage house. I don't look at it like that, but I'm not really considered. I have to come here and fight again and again and go to VCAT for that. So I feel that a very large group of the community who love the heritage, who respect the heritage, who don't put the sale of the house above all else, don't really get an equal say. That is my view. The second thing I want to say is I have never seen a proper study of Burundara showing, for example, aerial photos over the last 30 years and how much has been lost. I have never seen photos of magnificent properties and the dates they've been demolished. What is happening is little by little, we're losing everything, absolutely everything. And last year, 2019, before COVID, I went to VCAT with 5 other people and we fought desperately to save a property from being destroyed through inappropriate development. We were supported here. We had no hope at VCAT, and now every tree is gone from that property. We were told there were many trees left, and it's just a crisis. And I would like to see Council holistically approach this and show all of the members of the community what is truly being lost, what has been lost, because this is it's almost by stealth, we're losing everything, because ordinary people cannot come here every week and keep across everything. We're not paid employees, and there's only so much time we have. So that was what I want to say. I would like council to consider making aerial photos available, because we lose all the trees, so you'll see all the loss of the greenery, and actually doing a proper count of what's been lost and what's being damaged by inappropriate development. This is too difficult to go from house to house. It's just impossible, and that's what everybody relies on, unfortunately. So that's all I want to say. It's nothing specific. It's a much more broader concept. Thank you.
Thank you. Before you return to your seat, could I just check if there's any questions for you? Doesn't appear there are, so thank you for your presentation.
Thank you.
So our next speaker is Mr. Greg Price. And again, if you could just commence with your name and address, thanks.
Thanks. My name's Greg Price, 2A Breena Road in Glen Iris. Good evening. Thanks for the opportunity to let me speak. I think we need to go and recalibrate our heritage policies, as the current ones aren't achieving what most residents desire. There's a complete disconnect between the community definition and expectations of heritage versus the legal and scientific thresholds. The community loves the neighbourhood character and aesthetics of our lovely old houses, but not the technical heritage aspects. Council surveys have repeatedly found that only 9% of residents say that protecting heritage buildings is important. About 14% say that restricting the amount of new development is important, while up to 16% say that preventing development not in keeping with the character of their neighbourhood is important. This amendment doesn't achieve this. This is not to say that heritage isn't important, but it's a matter of how much and what. About 15,000 properties are currently restricted in Boroondara. This is out of about 69,000. So the real question becomes, how many should be protected and to what benefit? Here's a map of the houses or the properties that are currently restricted. We've got this massive creep going on. So the big question is, how large do we want this museum to become? Hawthorn panel study had 60 submissions, only 4 supporting it, whereas there were 45 objections and the rest were balanced. And this is a typical response rate for a gap study and for a panel report. If the current policies are working, then why are so many people unhappy with what's going on? Strategy 4.6 says, engage with the owners to achieve a balance, yet all the responses are typically rejected with justifications from the study report. This is not engagement. The report and the panels don't consider the development or the future, just meeting technical thresholds. The local community feedback should be the prime consideration, and controls should be locally based so that they can protect the streetscape and development appropriate to them, including unsightly houses. Planning was devolved to councils to give residents control. Current policies have massive social and economic impacts on owners without really achieving what residents want most. There is no study or policies to understand who really cares about heritage or how much they care relative to other considerations. Current policies only support the facadism, and mainly for the wealthy, because the cost of actually renovating properties is prohibitive given current building costs and so forth. There's no defined outcomes or plans for use of heritage properties going forward. The current plan is only just to implement controls, and that's it. Houses aren't artworks, they're functional and utilitarian. They all have a limited useful life expectancy, but yet nothing recognises this. We should protect the significant properties, but reevaluate the strategy for precincts, especially those that aren't highly intact. Thanks.
Thank you. We do have a question from Councillor Bigger.
Thank you, Mr. Price. Can I just clarify whether you're, and you may not want to say, but are you saying that you are in favour or not in favour of this amendment, or?
I'm partial in favour, and hence I tick both boxes. I'm in favour of protecting the significant houses. I'm not in favour of it being passed for the precincts, because essentially we've got these large spaces, and essentially properties that people don't really care about or think, or that residents don't consider as important, get caught up in this sort of thing. Whereas, it's a matter of being more specific, and in reality, people aren't wanting heritage applied to these things. They want their neighbourhood character retained, and some of that includes the aesthetics of these houses. So yes, there are definitely significant properties that need retaining, but just shouldn't be these going through and doing large precincts where it sweeps up a whole area, particularly where, and particularly for this amendment, there are some parts where there's a whole lot of redevelopment has already gone on, so it's not really intact in the first place.
Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you.
And we've also got a question from Councillor Franco.
Thanks. I had two questions, but the first one, Councillor Bigger actually asked. So my next question goes to the issue of precincts and the issue you've raised about neighbourhood character being the key issue in your view versus heritage per se. I'm wondering what your view, and I don't know if you really touched on this, of the non-contributory category, because the non-contributory category, doesn't that really address what you're saying, or does it not? In the sense that non-contributory seems to require development that's sympathetic.
It doesn't really, so non-contributory properties aren't really sympathetic in themselves to, or redevelopment isn't sympathetic. There's restrictions on the form of the development, but it doesn't stop you from going and putting some completely ugly house that's out of character with the other developments. But as long as it meets some criteria, and hence it destroys the scape, and so this is where covering non-contributory properties is a problem, because really the definitions are all wrong. It's like it's this technical heritage issue or scientific heritage issue, whereas what the residents really want is they want their these lovely beautiful old houses or properties kept, of which there are individual ones. They don't want ugly redevelopments. They want appropriate development for their area, and they want the streetscapes. I'm not sure if does that answer the question, or would you like to ask for that?
Look, I'll leave it at that, Greg. I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Okay, thank you.
I've also got a question from Councillor Hollingsworth.
Thank you, Mr Chair. Mr Price, I just wanted to ask if you're aware of the Burundara Community Plan that was done in 2017 that surveyed almost 12,000 people, and just expanding on that, if you were aware that one of the top themes as supported by the people surveyed was neighbourhood character and heritage. And one of the strategies recommended by the community was to preserve the history's heritage, protect the heritage properties and precincts under a municipal-wide heritage review.
It's getting a bit more like a speech.
And introduce heritage overlays. Thank you, Mr Chair. I just wanted to ask if you're aware of the community plan.
Yes, I was actually part of the refresh for the current community plan, and my statistics actually came from the sampling from the data from the resident surveys that time round, so 5 years ago, and the most recent ones. And essentially that's this whole thing about there's only 9% of people say that heritage is important, whereas these larger numbers, it's about development. And they're the council numbers that came from that community feedback.
Thank you, Mr Chair, for your indulgence. I'm not sure if I agree with the 9%, but I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Okay, and we've now got a question from Councillor Galt.
If I could just ask, I hear what you're saying about protecting individual properties, but not whole precincts, and being keen to preserve streetscapes, the feeling of areas. What mechanism would you propose to protect those streetscapes and areas?
Councillor Gold, I'm going to need you to just use a bit more of your microphone. The rest of us can't really hear. I know it's awkward.
I'll have to turn my back to you then.
No problem.
If I could just reiterate that question, that if you're in favour of supporting individual buildings but not the precinct, and you are keen to maintain the feelings of streets, the character of streets, have you got any proposal for how we would do that without overlays for areas?
So it would require planning scheme changes either via overlays or perhaps just other clauses in the planning scheme to restrict things. So my point is that although we're discussing a heritage issue here, and I think heritage should be restricted to heritage itself, where there is something significant. So the Bob Santa Maria property, as an example, that is actually heritage related rather than streetscape related. And there's the possibility for neighbourhood character overlays, or perhaps it needs to be done as a planning scheme thing, as for general, there's general criteria, just like there's res code criteria for buildings and things like that. But further on, what I would suggest is that the locals get more say in their area. So when we tighten up some of the requirements, and when people do want to go and develop, that it's the local residents who do get more of a say. So the controls become essentially localised, and it's possible to do that through the planning scheme. Now, whether it's done through overlays or just clauses in the Boroondara planning scheme overall, either would be possible.
Thank you. That exhausts the questions.
Thanks very much, councillors.
So our next speaker is Ms. Christina Brannigan. And again, Ms. Brannigan, if you could start with your name and address, please.
Yep. My name's Christina Brannigan. I live in Brinsley Road in Camberwell. I've been a resident in Hawthorn and Camberwell for about 30 years. Has my time started?
Yes.
Okay. Sorry. Okay. So I'm speaking tonight to thank the Council for their plan to protect the important architecture in Hawthorn East in the gap study, and to speak in particular about an important house in the Longford Estate precinct, which is up there on the screen. I'm hoping that tonight you will agree to give Currajong and Auburn Road a grading of individually significant. I was involved in helping to present at a planning panel last year after there'd been an amazing amount of work, a huge amount of work by a lot of people in the community, thousands of hours of research and investigations, including the Hawthorn Historical Society. And then two independent heritage experts, now Council's own Silverberg Consulting, and Nigel Lewis, an expert of 30 years' experience who was commissioned by the local residents, have both assessed the house now as meeting the high threshold for individually significant, due just to its architecture alone. So this is a very high bar, and it's not met lightly. So Currajong, as we can see from the images, is a very striking and elaborate 1880s double-canted base, single-storey Italianate villa with cranked return verandas. So you could in fact say, I think, that it epitomises one of the architectural styles we all associate with Hawthorn. It has Hawthorn written all over it, and local people, I do really believe, feel very connected to and love these places. And there seem to be three key reasons the experts gave Currajong a tick for meeting individually significant. Both state that there's strong circumstantial evidence that the house was designed by the great 19th century Melbourne architect John Beswick. He was a very creative and innovative architect and designed over 45 places in Hawthorn, including the Hawthorn Town Hall, many shops, and elaborate mansions, which I'm sure some of you know on Harcourt Street. And if you haven't had a chance to walk along the Auburn Road end of Harcourt Street and see the mansions that he designed and lived in with some of his family members, many of which are now protected, I'd recommend you do it. It's a great walk. There's a great book about him that we hold in the library. Both experts also agree that the design quality of the facade at Currajong, and in particular elements of the veranda and other decorations, are highly sophisticated and elaborate, and each consultant compares Currajong to other houses in Hawthorn graded significant, and finds that it's at least, if not more, finds that it is at least, if not more deserving than the comparative houses. They each find that the house, its form and roofline are highly intact, with only very minor changes to the building. And Council's expert states that there's strong likelihood that John Beswick designed Currajong, but its quality and sophistication warrant the raising of its grading from contributory to significant. So finally, I remember Councillor Thompson saying when we presented to him and Councillor Addis last year, he happened to say, somebody should write a book about this house. And I think that is so true. It's a house that was designed by a great creative architect for another creative craftsman who'd come from Melbourne from the slums of London via the Victorian goldfields. He created the first jewellery manufacturing business in Victoria. We have two...
Thank you. I'll need to finish you up there,
Okay.
I'm afraid. But,
all right.
We'll just check if there's any questions for you. It doesn't appear that there are, so thank you for your presentation.
Okay, thank you.
Our next speaker is Mrs. Mary Drost. have we? Yeah, yeah. Well, I think I have. I haven't shuffled them, so. Well, apparently there was an order. Are you happy to speak now, or would you prefer to wait?
I'm fine.
Okay, we'll do that.
I was waiting
so
for
if you could just start with your name and address, thanks.
Yes, Mary Drost, 34 Prospect Hill Road, Camberwell. Heritage house that was built in 1885. And in the area of, when I was a Camberwell councillor, it's in the area that I brought in as heritage between Riversdale Road and Canterbury Road. And to this day, that area is very well protected. And the tragedy is that I didn't cover the whole of the area, whole of Camberwell. Like you should have covered the whole of Hawthorn long ago, before any of this development started. At least now you're having some of Hawthorn East to be protected, but it's so little. Why don't you have the whole of Hawthorn East covered? It's worthy of protection. Have a look around. You know, imagine ruining the cities of Europe the way you're ruining this area. You'd be sent, in Paris, you'd be sent straight to the guillotine. Here you talk about gaps, because you've let so much change that through the years, when I brought it in, that area where I live was to be protected, Camberwell, from Canterbury Road to Riversdale Road. We're looking at back in 1985, okay, when I was a councillor here. And all these years have gone by and mighty little's been done about protection. Well, thank heavens you're doing a bit now, but don't just have gaps. Do the whole area. Protect it. Okay, some of the houses mightn't be heritage, but you could have the whole precinct of Hawthorn East protected to stop these blinking developers making a packet out of ruining our area. Don't just talk about gaps, talk about the precinct. I'm sorry, but I really feel very strong about this. Just imagine if I had just done that same thing here years ago, the area that is still considered the most heritage area of Burundara would have all been gone. So please, protect Hawthorn East, protect the whole area, just put a cover over it all, so that any developers who want to develop there have to really fit in with the local streetscape and not just build anything they want. So don't just do odd houses, do the whole area, please. This is your chance to do that. So, for pity's sake, protect the place better than it is now.
Thank you. There don't appear to be any questions. Our next speaker is Ms. Karen Caulfield. And again, if you could start with your name and address, please.
Karen Caulfield, 27 Currajong Road, Hawthorn East.
Thank you.
To register for this evening, I had to send an email to Robert Costello, and I got a response. It was very kind to say that yes, I was welcome. But the byline at the bottom was really, it made me feel warm. It says, Burundara, a vibrant and inclusive city meeting the needs and aspirations of its community. And congratulations, whoever came up with that byline. But what's profound is meeting the needs and aspirations of its community. So the statement that I want to make is the needs and aspirations of the Burundara community were expressed through the online petition, which attracted 5,000 signatures to save Currajong House. So I therefore support Council's recommendation for a regrading of Currajong House to individually significant. Thank you.
Thank you. And there are no questions. So our next speaker is Ms. Rosemary Blandon.
Thank you, Mayor and councillors. I'm arguing in the strongest...
Sorry, I'll just get you to start with your name and address.
Oh, my name is Rosemary Blandon and I live at 335 Auburn Road, Hawthorn.
Thank you.
I'm arguing in the strongest terms to urge the councillors to recommend the regrading of Currajong and that it be put through as part of the East Hawthorn Gap study where it belongs, not as a separate amendment. The time has come. This house was hours from demolition, literally hours. And through the concerted efforts of residents over the last 2 years, constant efforts, it is now clearly worthy of an individually significant overlay. Now. The community have always known this. That's why over 5,000 people signed a change.org petition wanting to preserve this house, and that was done within 10 days. It's a pretty loud message, and we want you to hear that. Ms Brannigan was cut short a bit, but our submission to the planning panel emphasised that this house tells the story of Hawthorn and Victoria, the rags to riches stories and the opportunity and the history of our great state and our great suburb. I want to thank Councillor Addis and former Councillor Coral Ross, Cynthia Watson and more recently Mayor Gary Thompson, Lisa Hollingworth and Di Gillies and Susan Bigar more recently for their efforts. The former council wrote to the minister on many occasions, urged by the residents, writing to the minister in an attempt to save this house. And it was literally hours from being demolished, yet it is so clearly individually significant. There's something very wrong with the process here. The planning panel has recommended the individual significant grading. The council's own consultant has recommended individual significance, along with a clearly qualified and experienced heritage consultant, probably the most experienced heritage consultant in Victoria today. The reason why the community submission was late, because I was not informed by the council and I was not listed as an objector, despite attending meetings and addressing the council and writing to the council almost on a daily, and council officers almost on a daily basis. I wasn't aware of the planning panel process. That's why it was late. So the owners clearly knew about all of this because that's why they applied for a demolition permit right off the bat. We weren't even informed, and it was only by accident we found about that house was about to be demolished. So they've had plenty of time for their objections to be heard.
I'll need to stop you there. Your time has expired and there are no questions, so thank you for your presentation.
Thank you, councillors.
Mr Costello, I'll return to you for matters arising, please.
Thank you, through you, Chair. I'll start off firstly with the basis for the municipal-wide heritage gap study being initiated back in 2016, and the basis of this study, irrespective of this particular amendment, was the fact that our community had become sufficiently concerned to warrant council investing over $1 million to carry out this study over a 5 to 6 year period. Sufficient houses had been lost and not enough had been protected in the eyes of the community that it was felt that council needed to embark on an undertaking of a considerable time, such as this particular study, that would ultimately deliver increased protection for heritage properties across the municipality. It wouldn't necessarily deliver protection for every single house in the municipality, but it would deliver protection to those that can be strategically justified as part of an amendment. And on that basis, the contacts were appointed to do the work. As part of every gap study we do, we undertake preliminary consultation. That is a process where we, first of all, complete the study and we then mail out to the entire suburb, not just to the affected owners, to the entire affected suburb. And that is the opportunity where we get to present the findings to the community. It is available to be viewed. Meetings can be arranged with officers to have these things discussed. Nominations can also be received through that process. Once it gets to a planning scheme amendment, the study is then adopted, and we then follow the statutory process in the Planning Environment Act in terms of undertaking a planning scheme amendment. And in each case, each amendment has been exhibited for at least 1 month. Each amendment has been to a panel hearing where evidence has been presented and tested, and in each case a report has been provided back to Council for the recommendation that each amendment be adopted, subject to changes. The same is the case in this particular amendment. In relation to Council's obligation to protect buildings and properties, the Planning and Environment Act sets out an objective that Council has an obligation to undertake these studies and to protect and identify buildings and to then progress amendments to make sure they are protected. And that is what Council has been doing since 2016 when they embarked on the municipal-wide heritage gap study, and what that we continue to do as we close it out with the final 3 suburbs. In terms of the application of heritage controls to precincts, it is understood that there are non-contributory properties included within heritage precincts. And the reality is, if you don't have a heritage overlay applying to a piece of land, you don't control heritage. You simply have no control, first of all, over its demolition, and ultimately over what building is built in its place. And that is why it is important when you have a cohesive precinct where the dominant grading of buildings is contributory, that you also capture non-contributory buildings to ensure that should those properties be redeveloped in the future, that an appropriate trigger is in place where that is a requirement under the planning scheme for it to be assessed. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to build exactly what's there. There is flexibility available, but it means that you can't go and build something that's unsympathetic to the heritage precinct, and therefore it must be respectful. In relation to Kurrajong, the grading recommendation from the inception of this study has been contributory to the Longford Estate and Environs Precinct. That is the position which was resolved on the 3rd of February 2020, and it was the position we took to the panel. Prior to the panel hearing, we received a community nomination. We circulated that to the panel and to the property owner. The reality is, unfortunately, that the community nomination was provided late in the piece. That's not the fault of anyone who provided it. It's simply just the reality of what we had to deal with. Exhibition had finished and we were embarking on a panel hearing process. The panel felt at the time they could not make a reasonable recommendation to regrade that building as part of this amendment on the basis that natural justice wouldn't have been served on the property owner. Throughout the process and lead up to the hearing, we received correspondence from the property owner. They acknowledged the contributory grading but objected to the individually significant regrading. On the basis that they had not lodged a submission of supporting submission or evidence had been sufficiently tested, officers have recommended that the regrading be undertaken through a separate planning scheme amendment process, and that is based on consultation we have had to undertake with the Department of Planning, Department of Environment, Land, Water of Planning, given that they are ultimately a key decision maker in how an amendment is ultimately gazetted in the planning scheme. And we run a risk that if we regrade the building as part of this process, that it could compromise the balance of the amendment on the basis of natural justice being served to that particular property owner. The department have recommended that, yes, if you decide to regrade, you should run it as a separate planning scheme amendment. And on that basis, officers have made that recommendation to the UPDC.
Thank you. Councillor Bigger, you're foreshadowing a motion. Do you have a question as well?
You read my mind.
Yes, I do that a lot.
It's frightening. I did have a question, but I think it related to that last point about Kurrajong, following up Ms. Blandon's comments about why not to do it now, and I think Mr. Costello has just answered that, so thank you.
Councillor Thompson.
Thanks, Chair. Through you. I'm a bit perplexed on the numbers. How many properties were captured in this gap study? And how many objections did we receive?
This is possibly the largest study that we've undertaken as part of the contract, in excess of 1,400 properties. 60 submissions received during exhibition and 10 parties to the panel.
So of those 60 submissions, how many were objections?
I can get that. I believe 34. 45.
So if my maths is correct, that's well and truly less than well, it's about 2% objections on this overall study. Thank you for that. Just to follow up on that, am I correct in understanding it's a requirement under the Planning and Environment Act to identify precincts?
Properties, yes, and that includes both individual places and precincts.
Thank you. That's all my questions. Thank you.
Councillor Franco.
Yes, I'd just like to ask a bit more detail about the implications of listing Kurrajong. Firstly, is it the case that we would not have complied with the consultation requirements under the Act explicitly as required if we were to proceed and seek to have... Sorry. Is it the case that we would not have complied with the consultation requirements under the legislation if we were to proceed and seek to have Kurrajong adopted as significant this evening? And secondly, and following on from that, are you concerned specifically about the amendment as a whole and the implications that could be put at risk, or purely Kurrajong in some way?
The advice we have received about regrading Kurrajong is to undertake it through a separate planning scheme amendment, and that involves, under the Act, full public exhibition of an amendment, and the availability and the affording of an opportunity for all parties to be involved in an independent panel hearing process. That's the basis of the recommendation. It's the advice has been from the Department of Planning that it shouldn't be you shouldn't be undertaken as part of this amendment, and that advice has been communicated as clearly as we possibly can in the report. As in addition to the natural justice being afforded to a property owner.
Can I just be clear as to whether the department thinks we wouldn't, or whether we have complied with the public consultation requirements, or would we not have, specifically on community consultation in relation to Kurrajong?
Yeah. During the life of the amendment, when the study was first adopted and authorisation was being sought, the process of an amendment is a legal process, and at that particular time the amendment was exhibited, Amendment C308, it was graded contributory to the precinct.
So can I just clarify, are you saying that the recommendation before us tonight is wholly compliant or not?
Yes, the recommendation is to maintain the contributory grade under this amendment and to proceed to adoption on that basis. There is resolution items in this particular report that say acknowledge and endorse the citation from Silverberg Consulting to regrade and then initiate seek authorisation to carry out a separate amendment to regrade that building. That's the recommendation. We maintain the grading on this in the current amendment, not upward, not regrade upwards.
Thank you. Councillor, Mr.
Thanks, through Mr. Chair. Just to add, so I think the issue here is that we've gone into a panel with a recommendation that Kurrajong is contributory. There's been a submission made at the panel hearing that it's significant. The panel has then asked us to go away and do some more work, which we've done. That's outside of that panel process, and we now have a recommendation from a heritage advisor that that the property is of significance, but we need to give the owner of the land, to be fair, the opportunity to have a say in respect to that. And the opportunity to have a say is to go through a separate planning scheme amendment process and have submissions for and against tested potentially by a panel if we receive submissions in respect to the amendment. So that's where we're up to. We've had the discussions with the department staff. They say that's the correct way to go about it. Run it as a separate amendment. We're keeping the recommendation at this stage that it's contributory, so we don't lose planning control. over the property. But to be fair, the department is saying, and the officers are recommending, that we run a second amendment process which will enable everyone to have their say through the normal planning scheme amendment process. Thanks.
Thank you. Councillor Addis.
Thanks very much, Chair. I just wanted confirmation that the property is effectively as protected from being demolished, being graded as contributory compared with should it end up being graded as significant.
Through you, Chair. Yes, the building still is contributory to a precinct. It still needs a permit for demolition. The heritage policy is quite clear that we don't support full demolition of a contributory building or of individually significant building. It will still have that. It will still have protection. Obviously, if it goes to the highest grade of individually significant, the level of demolition probably has a little bit more scrutiny around that. But as I've said, we have a citation that we are prepared to run on, and so on that basis, we would maintain the grading. It will still be in a heritage overlay. It still is in a heritage overlay. Hopefully it still will be when the amendment is ultimately gazetted, and it will have that grading until such time as they process a new amendment.
Councillor Hollingsworth.
Thank you, Mr Chair, and thank you, Mr Costello, for your presentation. Just wanted to ascertain timeframes of, depending on obviously the determination of Council's decision tonight, but if the officer's recommendations are supported as printed, what roughly would be the timeframe to go through the planning process amendment? And second to that question is, all the submissions put forward by residents, could they still be utilised rather than have everything duplicated and repeated?
Under a separate amendment, through you, Chair, under a separate amendment, people would relodge their submissions. It may well assist in accelerating the matter to a hearing if we have, obviously we'll have the community nomination that can be relodged. There might be other supporting submissions. The timeframes typically are at least a year to go through an amendment process, but the reality is the property is already protected. It's still got a heritage overlay on it, and it's still a contributory graded building to that precinct. So we'll be running the amendment. We would run that amendment, but it would also be in the knowledge that the property still is even in a heritage overlay, and either on an interim basis or a permanent basis whenever this particular amendment's gazetted. So I'd say it'd be at least a year.
Thank
but
you.
We're coming from a secure position of it being contributory.
Thank you.
So it seems that the questions are exhausted now, so Councillor Bigger.
Yeah, I would like to move a motion on this.
Yes, the officer's recommendation? Or?
Yes, please.
Yes. And Councillor Thompson?
Thanks, Chair. I'm happy to second, and if you allow your indulgence, I would mind saying a word or two.
Yes, I was just going to test that. So firstly, can I just test if there's any opposition at this juncture? No? Councillor Gillies, your light's on, but not to indicate... No. All right. Look, what I propose to do, even though there's no opposition, I'll invite whichever councillors would like to speak to do so, but please try and keep it brief in the spirit that it isn't opposed. So we'll start with you, Councillor Bigger.
Thank you. So, as most people here will know, this is work that began in 2016, long before actually I was sitting in this seat, when Council resolved to take on the municipal-wide heritage gap study, and Hawthorne East Heritage Gap Study was done in 2017-18, is my understanding. So it has been, seems to me, a long and thorough, careful journey to identify and protect the heritage of our community. And in my view, this amendment, it comes at an important time, I think, because many of us have spent time and more time in Burundara this year. And we've come to value what we have here even more, I think, certainly our trees, parks, the river, the sense of community. And importantly, I think the built form that we love and associate with living here, what brought one of the reasons many of us have came here. It's part of our history, a history and a cultural identity which we can see through many of our historic buildings across the municipality, and I think which we need to protect through the application of a heritage overlay. I just want to say that I've had multiple residents write to me as the ward councillor, particularly for Kurrajong and for many of the properties in this amendment, concerned that we work to preserve the heritage that cannot be replaced. They've told me how these homes give them a strong connection to their street, their community, that they give them a sense of place, which they value enormously. Many people have told me of the angst, the deep sense of loss, a physical wrenching that they have felt in watching some of these beautiful buildings torn down, and I certainly share that feeling. I think many of us do. In my experience, our residents understand the balance of needs. They know that urban density is balanced against urban sprawl, but they believe that we can take a thoughtful and an organized approach to ensure that necessary redevelopment takes place in structures which have little or no heritage value, and it doesn't need to lead to an assault on the soul and the character of our community. As a new councillor, already I've found that there are many rewarding experiences that come with this role. Moving this motion to support the protection of our rich and diverse history and heritage is, for me, one of those. So I'm particularly enthusiastic to be able to endorse the contributory grading for Kurrajong as part of the amendment, and to initiate a separate planning scheme amendment to regrade Kurrajong as individually significant. I may not have said that clearly, but I am trying to endorse the officer's recommendation. So with that, I think that's probably enough.
Thank you. Councillor Thompson.
Thanks, Chair, and I'll be brief. And I'd just like to thank our community members who presented this evening, Ms. Brannigan and Ms. Blandon, and in particular for the passion that our communities had in protecting Kurrajong. And I think where we've landed today is a very, very significant step in the journey of protecting this property. Initially it is a contributory, but ultimately, hopefully, it'll be an individually significant. And the architect, Beswick, as we all know, councillors, is the architect for the Hawthorn Town Hall. Beswick Square's been named after him. This is a property that has ties to Burundara as a civic place, but also Burundara as a cultural place. And as I mentioned, Ms. Brannigan last year, I would welcome the community sort of documenting the history of this particular property, because it actually does contribute significantly to our municipality. But wholeheartedly support the ward councillors' moving of this motion. Thanks, Chair.
Thank you. Councillor Franco.
Thank you. I'll be brief as well. In relation to Kurrajong, I was hoping to be able to push for its significance being adopted today, but on the advice of the officers, I understand that and will be voting accordingly. I do want to single out one, within Gardner Ward, where I've been elected, there are 4 individually significant properties, and I want to single out one just for a comment, which is 29 Lura Grove, the Kukiman residence. I may have pronounced it incorrectly, but I mention it because it's a post-war modernist property built in 1966 in the international style, and I'm very pleased. We often overlook modernist, mid-century modernist properties, and they're few and far between that get listed, so I like to always give them a push and a plug wherever I can to emphasise that, because I think it's really important that it's not overlooked. It's too easy. It's very easy to embrace the Federation properties, the Italianate, all the others that are so definitive of the character of Burundara, but we do overlook this category often, and it's usually when they're individually significant. I think in this case it is quite a striking property, and I'm very, very pleased to see it there. And I look forward to other mid-century properties getting heritage gradings as well. And finally, I just want to touch on a debate that was raised by residents here. Greg Price raised an issue about heritage precincts, but there are no heritage precincts in Gardner Ward, but I do want to say that I have been approached by residents wanting heritage precincts in Gardner Ward in specific streets, and they've pointed out particular streets to me that are, in their view, significant. And in the view of those residents, they see maintaining the streetscape character as being dependent on such precincts being created. So look, Greg Price has raised an alternative approach, and I don't want to enter into that debate, but there are two views on that, and it's something that's worth exploring. And I just note that there are no heritage precincts within Gardiner Ward at this time. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillor Galt.
Thank you. I just want to make two comments, and quickly. I was delighted tonight to hear some of the background of 337 Auburn Road. I hadn't been aware of all those things. I am aware of a number of other houses that architect has designed, and have looked at them in the past, and delightful to be brought up to speed on that. I believe what we're hearing from the officers tonight is that what's been proposed is the most sure way of getting it significantly registered. And what you're saying, I believe, is there's some risk to going down other tracks. I presume that you believe what you're being advised by state government, so I appreciate that. So I just hope we, with quite some vigour, pursue that higher listing as we go forward. I'd also like to take the opportunity to talk about, very quickly, about whole precincts. And I've sat through quite a number of SPAC meetings and urban planning meetings, and the level of frustration we often feel in being able to do something to protect buildings is palpable, because we don't have much power to do it. Much of what we work within is state government rules and regulations and overlays, etc., etc. And I believe that putting these overlays on gives us a much higher level of ability to do something to protect the buildings within those. So I commend this move.
Thank you. Councillor Bigger, would you like to exercise your right of reply?
I would not.
Excellent. Then I'll put that motion. Those in favour? That's carried unanimously. Thank you. That takes us then to item 3.2, Q Hebrew Congregation, the referral by Minister for Planning to Standing Advisory Committee. That report will be introduced by Nick Brennan, Senior Strategic Planner. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr Chair, and through you. The purpose of this report is to inform the Urban Planning Delegated Committee of the Minister for Planning's decision to call in the VCAT proceedings associated with the planning permit application for the Giant Steps School located at 11 Malmesbury Street in Kew. This property is proposed to be placed under a heritage overlay through Amendment C342. The Minister authorised Council to exhibit that amendment on the 13th of November 2020. Exhibition of the amendment has concluded recently, and officers will table a report to a future PDC to advise of the outcomes of that exhibition. On the 22nd of September 2020, under delegation from Council, a notice of decision to refuse to grant a planning permit was issued for a planning permit application for the Giant Step School at 11 Malmesbury Street, Kew. The planning application proposes to expand an existing education centre and includes the demolition of some of the existing buildings and construction of new buildings to facilitate an increase in staff and students. The buildings under threat of demolition by the planning permit application are proposed for heritage protection by Amendment C342. The planning permit application was refused on the grounds that the proposed demolition would have a detrimental impact on the social and cultural heritage significance of the site. The applicant subsequently appealed Council's decision to VCAT. On the 9th of April 2021, Council received notification from VCAT that the Minister for Planning has called in the planning permit application for the development of the site. The Minister's decision was prompted by his consideration that the VCAT proceeding raises a major issue of policy, and the determination of the proceeding may have a substantial effect on the achievement or development of planning objectives. The Minister has referred the matter to the Priority Projects Standing Advisory Committee for advice. The Standing Advisory Committee has scheduled a hearing on the 11th of May 2021. All parties to the planning permit application have been invited to make submissions, including Council. On the 14th of April 2021, the Minister also informed Council that he was deferring making a decision on Council's application for an interim heritage overlay for the site until after he had completed consideration of the development application. the Minister has not provided any guidance on how consideration of the development permit might impact on his consideration of the permanent heritage overlay, and has not provided any advice to Council regarding how to progress the planning scheme amendment. This decision raises serious concerns with respect to the prioritisation of the development proposal over heritage protection. The introduction of interim heritage controls would afford the site heritage protection whilst Council continues to progress Amendment C342 and appropriately requires any development to have regard to the heritage values of the subject site. The decision not to introduce interim heritage controls also disregards the prospect the heritage buildings can be repurposed to meet the ongoing needs of the Giant Steps School. In summary, officers have a number of concerns with the Minister's call-in of the VCAT proceedings in relation to the Giant Steps planning application, as discussed in the report. Officers are recommending that the UPDC write to the Minister for Planning prior to the commencement of the Standing Advisory Committee hearing to highlight the concerns listed within the report. Thank you.
Thank you. Councillors, are there any questions? Councillor Stavro.
I have a question and a foreshadow a motion as well in times, right, Mr.
Thank you.
I understand from your explanation and some earlier discussions that the rationale for taking the case away from VCAT is not, I guess, transparent, or it doesn't appear to meet the criteria. Is that a normal process?
Through you, Mr. Chair. No, this is not a normal or regular process. This is an extraordinary power that the Minister has to call in applications from VCAT. It's being used in this case for a matter that we would not necessarily describe as an extraordinary development.
Councillor Vigor.
Thank you, I'm okay.
I'm still trying to understand that. When you say it's not an extraordinary, meaning you don't understand why it has occurred in this circumstance, or is that something you can't really explain to those of us who don't understand?
Through you, Mr. Chair, all I mean by extraordinary is not ordinary. We consider many ordinary planning permit applications throughout the year, as well as normal planning scheme amendments. The Minister is able to extend his powers to deal with extraordinary or out of the ordinary or extremely large applications and developments, and this doesn't necessarily meet that criteria in our view.
Yeah, if I could just add to that, simply this is just a redevelopment of a portion of a school site. There are many school sites in Burundara which don't get called in by the Minister. Or other types of development which would be larger in scale. So this is a very unusual circumstance.
Thank you.
Councillor Galt.
Look, I probably, if I'd done a lot more research into the background of this, and I did read through it today in quite some detail, but the substance of the overlay and the recommendation of this site, is it a lot to do with its cultural significance and heritage significance to a particular group, or is it generally believed to be significant within the area? And just, if I can extend the reason for asking that question, is that the group that it would be most advantageous to and most highly valued by, are they the same group that are now proposing to redevelop the site?
Through you, Mr. Chair. The site's been identified within the citation that has been prepared by our heritage consultants. It's been described as having cultural and architectural significance together, as well as rarity of some of the buildings on the site. In terms of who would benefit from the site being in the heritage, we would argue that while the broader community would benefit from that site being retained and being able to continue to tell its story, and the occupancy of the site is somewhat complex. There is a trust that manages the ownership of the site. There is also a group, which is the congregation, which could be understood as a occupant of the site or a tenant of the site through the synagogue, and there is also the school, which would be could be understood as a tenant using the school portion of the site. That is a brief rundown, and I would not say that that is a detailed explanation of all the occupants, but that is how they can be understood.
If I might ask a follow-up question on that, I didn't see any mention in the report to say what the substance of the redevelopment proposal. I presume we know what was being proposed to be built there after the demolition, and I'm really asking a question around, was there potential for adaptive reuse of the buildings and potentially enhancing them or not? Or is that too subjective?
Thanks through you, Mr. Chair. Yes, we're certainly aware of what the planning application was as a detailed assessment that was undertaken as part of the consideration of the planning application that was refused, and then that decision was appealed. So certainly aware of what that is. I can't step into the mind of the applicant, if you like, as to whether they explored whether the buildings could have been reused on site or extended. You know, there are all sorts of considerations that would go into decisions about how best to develop a site to meet particular needs. So I can't really respond in any great detail to the second part of your question.
But it was full demolition of some of the buildings considered as valuable.
Yes, that's correct.
Councillor Franco.
A lot of my questions have been asked by Councillor Gold, but just what's remaining for me to ask is, just to be clear, the amendment was triggered, our request for the amendment for significant heritage overlay to be applied in relation to this site was triggered by the incoming of the permit application at the time, which caused us to review the site. Is that correct?
Through you, Mr. Chair, we received a request from a community member to investigate the heritage of the site. That was not brought about. It was not sent to the Strategic Planning Department because there was an active plan permit application. That request to investigate the heritage from a community member may have been triggered by the planning permit consideration, but it was not. The trigger to investigate the heritage of the site was a request from a community member.
And there's limited information in this report, and I appreciate it's been put together at very short notice, but is it the case that the request for heritage overlay for this site is focused on the religious or cultural significance, or is it also the architectural merit of the building? And to what extent is it the architectural merit? Because we just don't have that information. The report reads as if it's the cultural and religious significance of the site. And I wonder whether that's still ongoing and whether that's a feasible thing to be protecting. That's going to be my next question. Are we trying to continue that practice? Or are we trying to retain the architectural merit of the site?
So, through you, Mr. Chair, the prepared heritage citation nominates the significance identified in the site, and it identifies both cultural and architectural elements within the site that have heritage significance. The citation goes into quite a bit of detail of the various elements of the site and the various buildings on the site and the significance that they have.
To what extent?
Just a moment. Mr. Mitchell, you wanted to add?
Thank you. Yes, through you, Mr. Chair, if I could just add, the purpose of this report is not to further the planning scheme amendment. The purpose of this report is to advise councillors of the ministerial call-in, and the recommendation is set out in the report, and the recommendation is we write to the Minister and outline our concerns in regard to that process. There's a full report with all the details of the planning application, the citation, all the rest of it that's coming up to, or scheduled to come up to UPDC meeting in 2 weeks' time. 2 weeks' time.
Given that, I won't ask any more questions. Thanks.
Councillor Thompson.
Thanks, Chair, through you. Just trying to understand a sequence of events here. So Amendment C3420, Bureau, that's actually been through the Minister's office and gazetted. Is that correct?
Through you, Mr Chair, no, that's not correct. We have adopted the citation as council. We've written to the Minister to seek authorisation. He has granted authorisation for us to carry out the planning scheme amendment. It has been exhibited. It was exhibited at the start of this year, and we'll be bringing a report back in 2 weeks with the summary of that exhibition. So that's the stage we're at.
So he's accepted it in its entirety, which includes this property.
He has authorised the preparation and exhibition of the amendment for the amendment of this property, yes.
Yep. So on one hand, the Minister's saying it's okay to go out to the community and seek submissions on its heritage value. On the other hand, he's calling it in, saying it maybe doesn't have heritage value. Am I understanding that correct?
Through you, Mr Chair, yes, that is correct.
Is this the same Minister that alludes to Burundara not doing enough to save heritage in the municipality?
Probably not a question for officers.
Thank you, Mr Chair.
I'll leave my questions there, Chair. Thank you.
I think that's exhausted our questions, so I'll return to Councillor Stavru, who foreshadowed a motion. You just need to, yeah.
Thank you, Mr Chair. Let me first thank the officers for the excellent work they've done to outline all the issues, and I guess the issues are many, but in regards to the recommendation, that's a clear recommendation, and I'd like to move the motion to adopt the recommendation by my fellow councillors.
Thank you, and I think that's seconded by Councillor Thompson.
You bet, Mr Chair.
Okay, and just to assist Councillor Stavru, is there any opposition at this juncture? It appears it will probably be unopposed. Councillor Stavru, if you'd like to speak to it.
Look, thank you, Mr Chair. I'll be very brief. I think the key thing for me is first the great work done by the officers to ensure that we protect appropriate heritage, and I might hasten to say that heritage is not one of another thing. There's multiple heritage. There's heritage in architecture, there's heritage in history, so we need to look at it holistically, and sometimes certain buildings may have one type and sometimes it may have another type of heritage, but they're all contributing to this rich tapestry that we call Burundara. But apart from making that comment, I haven't got anything else to say, apart from it would have been nicer, I guess, for the Minister to be a little bit more transparent. But other than that, the motion as I've put it forward.
Thank you. I'll put that motion then. Those in favour? That motion's carried unanimously. That takes us then to item 4, general business. Are there any items of general business? Item 5, urgent business. Are there any items of urgent business? Item 6, confidential business. Are there any items of confidential business? Then I declare the meeting closed. Thank you for your attendance.